So welcome to Office 365 Administration Best Practices. Let's see who we have in the crowd here. How many of you are already on Office 365? Good. You're in the right spot. How many of you are not yet there? Okay, so if you're not yet there, some of the best practices that we have are going to be for those of you getting ready to deploy or migrate. So there should be something in here for everyone. When I was asked to present this a couple months ago, I thought, this is great. You know, I've got a chance to go beyond Exchange sessions and start talking about all the cloud-related stuff. And I figured, well, all I got to do is go start looking at the documentation that we have around best practices for Office 365, and we're set. That'll be what I'll deliver. Well, it turns out we don't have any. If you've ever gone looking for it, you may have realized that we don't really have an official collection of best practices for Office 365 administration. So we're changing that with this session. This session is going to be the basis for that subject going forward. Now, because we didn't have any content, I went very wide across the company. I talked to folks in the field, talked to folks in support, in engineering, in marketing, all over the place to collect for you what will be eventually a definitive list of best practices for this. Hopefully some of this stuff you already knew, because a lot of the stuff that came from the field are best practices that the field folks are telling customers. It just is stuff we haven't officially documented. Some of the other content actually came from support cases, looking at the top volume drivers in our calls and looking at the root cause to figure out what are customers doing wrong that are getting them into this situation. So we've got kind of a wide variety for you. So the key takeaways really are just to initially understand some of the best practices that we have right now, and there will be a wide number of areas that we'll cover, but also to get a foothold on emergent best practices as well, things that we haven't formalized or codified, but that will also be stuff that we would want you to do, or in certain cases, not want you to do. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Schnall. I'm a senior program manager on the Office 365 Customer Experience team, CXP for short. I'm actually on a small sub-team called the Market Development Team, and we're responsible for growing markets by removing barriers to Office 365 adoption in the areas of security, compliance, regulation, and so forth. So if you do anything with ISO, FedRAMP, auditing, and so forth, and you have questions about that, come see me at the booth, and we can talk about that stuff too. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Out of curiosity, how many of you have seen my tips and tricks presentations before? Okay, a few of you. So because we didn't have a formal collection of best practices, I thought that would kind of be the best format to adopt here, because basically I just looked for best practices in every area I could think of, and so that's kind of how I've organized things. So I like to kind of start out with a normal progression of how you might go through it as an administrator. So I figure starting with deployment and migration is a good place to start. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about as a best practice is, how many of you in the room have more than 150 mailboxes that you're going to want to move to the cloud? All right. As I suspected, most of you. Okay. So the first thing you're going to want to do is, if you have more than 150 users, don't do this yourself. Use the Microsoft Onboarding Center. Has anybody already gone through the Onboarding Center? No. Wow. That's a surprise, especially given the number of hands who said they were already on the cloud. You definitely want to use the Onboarding Center. This is the place where we are, where we used to deliver what we call Fast Track. So the Fast Track is an accelerated process where you're guided by Microsoft throughout the deployment, throughout the migration, to make sure that it's as frictionless as possible to get you onboarded. And this is where you've got every single Microsoft expert across the company who in any way is responsible for onboarding customers is part of this Onboarding Center. Okay, so it's a requirement for them to do that. And the Onboarding Center, all of those people who work within the Onboarding Center, they report directly to engineering as well. So that there's a direct tie and a feedback loop between the onboarding process and the engineering team. And that's one of the benefits of being in the cloud. If we can get that rapid feedback, we have the ability to change the onboarding process to remove bugs, mistakes, oversights, or introduce new scenarios that we hadn't considered. It is available within 8 languages. And all you do is you purchase Office 365 and you begin this service within 30 days. You do have a 30-day window within which to do, and you do have to make a purchase before you do it. The typical length of the engagement is Typically, it does depend on the customer's environment, but it typically has been lasting about 4 to 6 weeks. But what we do say is when you sign up for this is we're going to stick with you until Exchange, Skype, SharePoint, Delve, Yammer, until all those things are deployed to your satisfaction. So don't think of the 4 to 6 weeks as that's all the time you get. We're with you until your deployment is done in that respect. All right, let's talk about some migration best practices. And how many of you are familiar with the different ways that you can migrate into Office 365, particularly from on-premises Exchange or some other mail system? All right, just a few of you. Well, these are all the different types of migrations that we have. Hybrid's usually up the top because it is the richest feature set and the most full fidelity type of feature set. But you can do an IMAP migration, a cutover migration, a stage migration. The best practice here is to make sure that you understand your migration options. And that's simply because in a lot of cases, you're only going to get one chance. Okay, it's very difficult to start rolling back a botch migration if you feel like you picked the wrong one, or if you weren't aware of the limits of some of the migration types and you realize later on that you're beyond those limits. So it's very, very important to choose the right type of migration. When you are migrating and you start onboarding, you want to watch out for DNS issues. And it's very easy to run into them, in part because of the wizard that we use that tries to sign things up and get everything set up from a DNS standpoint with as little input from the customer as possible and with as little friction as possible as well. And so if you haven't seen it, this is typically the screen that comes up when you're ready to onboard and add your first domain to it. Start out with this step 1. And you put in your domain name. And then once you've done that, you're on to step 2, assigning users and licenses. And you get to that part. And here you've got a couple choices. You know, you may want to add users one at a time. You may want to add them in bulk. You might want to not add them at all. But here's the thing. At this point, if you add users, you start breaking some of your migration options. You break cutover, you break staged, and you break hybrid. But we don't tell you that in the wizard. So we have a lot of customers who are going through the wizard and going through this process and running into problems because the wizard is non-optimal and lets them get into that stage. But let's say they were smart and they choose the third option that's not circled that says, I don't want to add users at this time. So they continue on. On to step 3, setting up the domain and configuring DNS. When you get to this page, there's a couple things that are already checked. Maybe you want SharePoint at this point, maybe not. But here, the impulse for most customers, based on the telemetry we've received from the onboarding center, is that they just see these things clicked and they want to select next. And then they do that, and now they're ready to set up DNS. And they may be using GoDaddy, which you can see on the left-hand side, or they may be using our wizard, which you can see on the right side. But either way, when they're done, once they configure these records, now they've broken a few things. They've broken Mailflow for IMAP. They've broken it for staged. They've broken it for cutover. And they've also broken Auto-Discover for staged, cutover, and hybrid as well. So we are working on improving this. But again, it's very important that you understand the implications of what even seems like the most basic choice when you're going through this process. Ideally, though, we don't want any customers to get into any bad situations. So we are working very hard to improve things. All right, so I mentioned some of these best practices came from support. So they came either anecdotally from engineers in support, or they came as a result of deeply researching our support calls. So you'll see that a lot of the best practices we're going to talk today are things that are best practices because they're generating a high volume of support calls, and they're things that we want you to do. So one thing that's generating a top support call, at least in the past month or two, didn't go too far back, I wanted things to be very current, is the fact that you've got mailbox moves and load balancers and certificates in the mix. So we do have the ability for you to use multiple migration endpoints, and that lets you schedule moves and do things like not impair your users too badly by spreading the load around. But typically what happens is load balancers as the endpoint for remote moves can often introduce these failures that are unpredictable and unexpected. And part of that could be because the remote moves are moving from server to server. Part of that could be because the load balancer can't keep up with the traffic. Part of it could be just because of the complexity that some folks have with their load balancer and firewall environments. So one of the things that we recommend in some cases is not actually using a load balancer for the migration endpoint and just going right to the endpoints and letting them stream continuously from source to target without switching over the load. With respect to certificates, all the moves use HTTPS, and so they rely on valid certificates in order for them to succeed. If your certificates are not valid, if they're not trusted by both your on-premises organization and the cloud, you're going to run into all sorts of move problems where they just won't execute. So for those of you who may have used your own internal PKI for terminating SSL for HTTP traffic, you could run into some issues because those certificates are not going to be trusted, obviously, by the cloud since you've rolled your own. So that's very important, and you'd think it would be, sort of admin 101 these days with certificates since they're used everywhere. But the invalid or expired certificates is still a top call generator for us, and so we would want you to verify that you've got everything running properly before you actually do these moves. You also want to familiarize yourself with the migration throughput documentation. I know that in the last session that Michael and Tim delivered, they were talking about some of the factors that can affect your migration rate, and then they talked about things like firewall config and contention at the source and the number of items and so forth. You really want to make sure that you understand not just all those restrictions and requirements, but also the fact that you're migrating not only off of your own network, which is very dynamic, but you're also migrating to our cloud services, which are also very dynamic. So literally, the migration rate you get could simply be something as a factor of what day or what time it is. If the system happens to be particularly busy, that's going to slow down everybody's migration. If the system isn't particularly busy, you may see faster migration. So there's other things to consider besides just those throughput mechanisms that were talked about in the last session. So as an example, somebody gives us a support call and they say, well, when I was moving mailboxes on Wednesday and Thursday, things went really, really slow around 2 p.m. But when I came in and I started moving mailboxes on Saturday and Sunday, things went much faster. So is there something I need to look at with my configuration that might be causing that? And the fact is, it's just due to the dynamic differences in the activity that's going on. All right, so the amount of time it actually will take you to migrate mailboxes is going to be determined by the available and maximum capacity of your network. So from a network perspective, before you even start the migration, as a best practice, you really want to investigate whether or not your network and the network infrastructure that you have can support the increased load that it's going to have. So that means looking at your routers, making sure that they support as good a throughput as you can get. Typically, it's not going to be as large as maybe the pipe you might have to the internet. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but you want to make sure that it can support the extra load that you're going to place on it. You may also have to contact your ISP to find out if there's any restrictions on the amount of allocated bandwidth that you have. That could mean after you've consumed a certain amount of bandwidth, there will be throttling done or maybe a little bit lower rate of a connection for you. So you may need to find out when are the best times for you to transfer a lot of data on there. Hopefully use a lot of tools to evaluate your network capacity, not just internal tools, but some of the external speed test tools that they have on the internet. And you may want to check those not only from multiple locations, but using different tools just to correlate and validate the responses that you're getting. You also want to make sure that you test the end-to-end flow. So it's not just enough to do the speed test. You may also want to do pings and tracer Ts to all of the endpoints within the Office 365 data centers that you might be using. And we publish the URLs and IP addresses of those, so anybody can go and find those out and start seeing what the network connection is. And then you'll also want to be aware of any other loads that might be on your network as well. So obviously from an Exchange perspective, that could be remote backups that are occurring. But there could also be many line of business applications out there that are also doing things at certain hours on your network that you'll want to be aware of so that you can schedule the moves accordingly as well. All right, with respect to stability, this should be a no-brainer, but really network stability can cause, or instability rather, can cause all sorts of problems with the migration itself. So it's important that you get your hardware vendor's recommendations for whatever hardware you're using to make sure that you're using the latest version or versions that have been patched. Network delays, again, any delays between your infrastructure and the Microsoft data center could be a huge problem for you as well. That's another thing that you want to look for. And make sure that your firewalls or your routers or anything that you're using to restrict traffic allows full and unfettered access to all the Office 365 IP addresses and URLs. And again, we do publish a list of it, which you can get at that link. All right, data extraction itself is a very intensive task. You know, taking the data out of your mailboxes, putting it into Exchange Online mailboxes, that really requires sufficient resources on the source system itself. It's got to have enough CPU time, enough memory, and enough disk performance to give you an optimal migration performance. Now, during migration, if the source system is often close to full capacity in terms of your regular workload, it's very important that you, again, find other endpoints or try to increase the amount of system resources that are available as well. So, for example, if you've got two servers, one of them has 50% resources available, another one has or 50% more availability than the second server, you would want to use the server that had that. And again, other back-end tasks, they can frequently choke out activity, especially if they're very disk intensive. Source disk contention is going to be the #1 bottleneck of your migrations. So if you've got even things like aggressive antivirus or backup or line of business applications, things like that, you want to go ahead and make sure that those things are at least tuned or not interfering or consuming more resources than they should. And it could mean that as a result of having all these things on the systems, that you're left with no choice but to do the migration during non-working hours. That is simply the case for some customers. Now, it's also a common practice to protect email systems in particular, but sometimes other workloads with throttling mechanisms. And those can also set limits on how fast and how quickly data can be migrated from one point to the other. So you want to make sure that you don't have any throttling limits, both within Exchange, if you're coming from that, or from other mail services if you're migrating some other way. So as an example, Google Mail, if you're coming from Google Mail, they set limits as to how much data can be extracted out within certain time limits. So that could be a factor in slowing down your migration. And same with Exchange. Depending on the version that you're running, there are both IMAP throttling policies and RPC over HTTP throttling policies that can kick in and delay migrations as well. So watch out for those things. And then if you are using any third-party tools, as a best practice, our recommendation is to do third-party tool-based migrations during the off hours, so weekends, evenings, holidays, etc. All right, network best practices. We do actually have some tuning guidance for each of the workloads, and we've consolidated them all on a single page. You can go to aka.ms/tune to get them. But you do want to follow the tuning guidance for each workload because some of them have very specific requirements in order to do the migration. So that's very, very important. You also need to monitor the network continuously for high latency and low bandwidth. Doesn't matter if you have very high bandwidth. If you also have high latency, that's going to slow things down considerably. And you want to make sure, again, that your proxies, your firewalls, your routers, and all the other pieces of equipment in between your organization and the cloud are also up to speed in terms of how fast they can get the data out there. You may find, in fact, some of the customers, based on the calls that we've gotten, have gone through their network and found different MTU settings for some of their network equipment. And that can very dramatically slow things down if you suddenly go from, say, for instance, 1,500 down to 500 or something like that. So you want to be aware of that. The other thing to be aware of, if you are using a large number of shared calendars and shared mailboxes or public folders, there will be additional connections that will be made by the Outlook client as well, which could further affect the performance on your network and the performance of your network devices as well. In fact, usually it could be up to an additional 2 connections for each shared mailbox or each shared calendar that you may be using. And when we talk about proxies and firewalls supporting this. We're talking about the ones you use for egress, so the ones that are going out of your network, not the ones that are coming in. And as a best practice, your organization should really start thinking, if you haven't done so already, thinking about evolving your network for public cloud connectivity. You know, that's something that eventually every organization is going to have to do. That's something that MSIT has done, in fact. They have completely changed our network, specifically tailoring it to public cloud connectivity. In fact, they realized a lot of their network challenges as they were moving some of their properties to the public cloud. And so to address these, we actually undertook a series of projects that were directly aimed at improving network performance. And that include things like a deep analysis of what we were sending to the cloud, what we were receiving from the cloud, and trending the flow over time to see recognizable patterns as well. And so once you do that, once you see these recognizable patterns, then you can start to make, in some cases minor, in other cases significant changes to your network infrastructure, again, to evolve it towards persistent public cloud connectivity. All right, we also want you to consider using multiple user edges as well, because if you've got a replicated, distributed edge design, that helps scale out the volume of internet traffic, and it also provides redundancy if there's any kind of an outage. Again, these best practices are not only for everyone, these are exactly the things that MSIT has already done for us. You also want to understand the flow details. So when you are doing the analysis of your network, you're going to be doing so before you begin your migration, particularly if it's a hybrid application, so that you can understand your current mail flow patterns and then adjust them as necessary as you start moving to the public cloud. You also want to make sure that you include your security teams if you have separation of administration, because if you just are using the workloads that aren't aware of any security policies that have been put in place, the restrictive security policies could end up impeding or interfering with completely with your migration as well. All right, a couple other things. Browser best practices. Doesn't really matter what browser you're using. We support the latest version of all of them. Could be IE, could be Chrome, could be Firefox, and so forth. Ideally, and this is going to be true for almost every browser, whether you're using our cloud service or not, but you really want to go in and look at the add-ons that are in there and disable any of them that aren't needed or aren't necessary and so forth, because that can very seriously impair the user experience. You also want to make sure that the temporary internet files is large enough to hold the data that may be cached to it. And believe it or not, we actually recommend that end users keep their browser window open all during the day and not close it. You know, obviously lock their workstation if they walk away, but keep the browser open. For one thing, they don't have to re-authenticate, and then for another, it reduces the amount of round trips that you'll be making to Office 365 as well. So it's sort of a user experience optimization, if you will. And then another way to reduce round trips, particularly with respect to SharePoint, is don't make these long lists of documents and folders and whatnot. Try to create smaller libraries or smaller lists, or put documents right up in the front page so somebody doesn't have to click a bunch of times to drill down into the information that they're looking for. Or even better, just simply create custom views that minimize page load times because they only contain that certain amount of content that you want in there as well. All right. Let's talk about the Office 365 import service. Has anybody heard of that? All right, a couple of you. All right. So the import service is a service that we have that provides two new options for migrating from on-premises to Exchange Online. One option would be to literally copy the data onto a drive and then ship it to Microsoft. Just the drive, no cables, nothing like that. Just ship us the drive. We will take it from there. And we will also, assuming you follow our instructions and include the return envelope, we will send that drive back to you when we're done importing it. You do also have the options to import files and upload them directly over the network as well. So it really depends on what your comfort factor is or what your networking capabilities are as to which one that you'll choose. In terms of why these services are great, well, for one thing, they help really address a lot of the compliance needs because the data's in place and it's being moved and accessible to the same native search tools that you're using. It'll be subject to retention policies. It'll be covered by auditing controls and so forth. And in addition, it helps protect against data loss because you'll be taking the PST files, if you will, and removing them from your network and allowing all of your mail to be where it should, which is in people's mailboxes, which is replicated and filled with redundancy and performance and so forth. So it really does provide you with several benefits. And it does also, instead of using the PSTs, which are only available to Outlook clients, now it makes all this data available to your ActiveSync, to your HTTP, to your OA clients, and so forth. All right, a couple miscellaneous ones. For those of you who have already signed up for Office 365, how many of you have branded the login page? All right, that's great. That's great. Not only does it give your login page, obviously, your corporate look and feel, but believe it or not, there's a security aspect to it. It can act as a site key. If you're not familiar with the concept of a site key, it's usually a picture on a secure site, like a banking website. You sign into the bank, and they display a picture that you've previously chosen. And the fact that you can display that picture and see that picture allows you to know that you're actually on that bank site and not on some spoof site that looks a lot like it. And there are some very, very good spoof sites out there that look exactly like the banks you may be using or the credit card companies you may be using. But these look-alike sites don't know what everybody's site key is. So they don't have a way to personalize the spoof, if you will. And this is another way. You know, if you're at all worried about our portal page being spoofed or somebody logging in the wrong place or sending their credentials to the wrong place, you can simply brand it, put your own background on it, put your own logo on it, and that will effectively act as an identifying site key for them. And then also take some of the burden off your admins. As a best practice, we want all administrators to enable self-service password management for the users. So that way, users can go ahead and reset their own passwords, not have to burden IT, not have to call Microsoft support, not have to really get anybody else involved except do their thing by themselves. All right. All right, let's talk a little bit about identity. I know I've heard from some customers who have said, I'm confused. You've got like 5 or 6 DirSync type tools. What am I supposed to use here? And it can be confusing because we do have, as you can see, 4 or 5 of them listed on the screen. So DirSync is what we started with, and that is the default one that we're using in Office 365 and the Azure portals. So that was the old school one. It's actually still in use by many customers, particularly those that have simple single forest deployments. There are other methods, though. You've got the Active Directory module for PowerShell. You've got the Azure AD Graph API. And the Office 365 portal itself. But really, ideally, if you're not using DirSync, the next tool you would choose, because you've got a more complex environment or you've got a scenario that DirSync doesn't solve, should be the Azure AD Sync. But now, having said that, Azure AD Sync is being phased out in favor of Azure AD Connect. However, Azure AD Connect is only in preview right now and therefore cannot be used in your production environments. There are a few select customers that are using it as part of a supported deployment, but although you can download and start playing with Azure AD Connect, you cannot use it in production just yet. But once it's released for production, then it's really the tool that you should be using, and it will replace both DirSync and Azure AD Sync. FIM plus connector, those are way old. Shouldn't be used at all for new deployments. If you still happen to be using those in your organization, they are still supported, but ideally you'll want to move to the newer technology. But there's no need to jump to Azure AD Sync right now and then go to AD Connect. You might as well wait till Azure AD Connect is released, and then you could go from the FIM plus connector right to Azure AD Connect. The other thing to keep in mind is DirSync doesn't do attribute validation. So you do have the ability to actually sync invalid attributes up into the cloud. So before you actually start the synchronization process, you're going to want to use our ID Fix tool and go ahead and clean up the most common errors that we find in user on-premises directories. Once ID Fix has done its thing, then you should be able to go ahead and do your DirSync and start rolling that way. All right. A couple other things I mentioned. One of the benefits of Azure AD Connect is it will run on domain controllers, so you won't need an extra server for DirSync. And I mentioned that we do have a select few customers working on public preview 2 right now, and I believe that will be the last public preview, and then we'll be ready to release that. All right, UPN management can be very complex in a DirSync-enabled world. This is a chart that this actually came from Tim Heaney, who does a lot of work in this space, and he was graciously gave it to me to share with you in this slide deck. And this gives you basically the management interfaces and a listing of what the UPN prefix and suffix support is that we have within the environments. Now, I see a lot of you taking pictures, and that is totally cool. But these slides will be available for download later on, so you will have access to everything, not just what you see on the slide, and the recording will have what I said, but also there's tons of notes in this slide deck too, with links and scripts and other things that you're going to want to get your hands on. All right. Speaking of scripts and stuff, let's talk a little bit about PowerShell. Now, I know Lawrence has the tools and techniques for Office 365 administration, so he's covered the basics of PowerShell. And Wes has the advanced PowerShell for Office 365 administration coming up, so I didn't want to cover that stuff. But believe it or not, there are still a couple best practices that haven't really been discussed yet. And one is to try to script as much as you can. Believe it or not, even simple things like logging into the service, I've seen customers type in the lines manually by themselves and go through that process instead of just scripting the 3 lines that you could do to make it available. Here's one way to do that. Create your own personal scripts folder. Make sure that you install the appropriate modules, in this case, Azure AD, SharePoint, and Skype for Business Online. You don't have to worry about Exchange. Those are fully remotable, so you don't have to install those. Once you get the modules in, write scripts using the PowerShell ISE, and then create shortcuts where you've got a PowerShell.exe launching those scripts. So let me just quickly show you what that might look like. So here's actually an example of a combo login. So here's one single script, just a few lines, save it as a PS1 file, and you'll be logging in both to Exchange Online and to what used to be Lync Online, but is now Skype for Business. Okay, just one simple console. Let me actually switch over to real quick. 1 second. All right, so if you're not familiar with the PowerShell ISE, it comes with Windows, comes with PowerShell. This is literally exactly what the script looks like. You're just getting the credential. You're importing the session. You do have to authenticate. It's not saving a password anywhere, so it's safe to just keep and not worry about somebody else logging into your credential account. But here's just one example of what it looks like. If I wanted to show you what the combo example looks like, here's that. It's just a few more lines. Gets me into both Exchange Online and Skype for Business Online in the same single session. I'll actually have a separate session going to each of them, but in the same PowerShell session. And then I can run commandlets against them both and not have to go back and forth and logging in and logging out or create multiple windows as well. So just to show you that this actually works. Let's see, what did I not? Oh, right, I didn't change the execution policy. This is not a corporate laptop I'm running on right now, so it's telling me I don't have remote access, or remote sign execution. But still, had I had that, you would have been able to see it log in. All right. But seriously, you can just copy and paste this yourself and create your own script for a single login or for a multiple logon. And the ones that I've created, I'm going to go ahead and put into the Yammer group for Ignite, so you'll be able to download those if you don't want to make your own. All right, let's talk about SharePoint Online. How many of you are using SharePoint Online? All right, how many of you that are using SharePoint Online think you fully understand the SharePoint permissions model? What a surprise, what a surprise. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. And that was actually one of the best practices that came to this session from the SharePoint team. They said, you know, we have a lot of calls, a lot of customers who don't understand how to manage permissions in SharePoint. And it's actually not that complicated once you understand the basic elements that come into play. So there's really just the three key elements that you see here that you need to deal with. One is permission inheritance. That's a concept everybody should know about in here. One is permission levels, which we sometimes call SharePoint roles. And then you've got SharePoint groups, or what we sometimes call SharePoint security groups. Okay, those permissions get applied to sites. Okay, so if you work on a site, you're working within a site collection. Every site exists within a site collection. That's why it's called a site collection. And then every group in SharePoint has a certain permissions level. And all the users in that group have that same permissions. Now, a site collection administrator is responsible for customizing the permissions. And that is a best practice, to customize the permissions to better reflect your organizational roles. Stopping permission inheritance, creating new groups, and new permission levels are ways to optimize permissions. And as with most web-based properties, the sites can have multiple owners. And you could have multiple sub-sites underneath the sites that can also have their own custom permissions as well. So you get very granular. But typically what we want you to do as a best practice is really just staying with the three default groups before you start to customize it too much. We do want, as a basic rule, we want you to keep permission inheritance intact for all your sites, for your libraries, for your lists, and for all the items. But there will be cases where you're going to have to break permission inheritance. And that's typically when you've got a work group that are working on files or documents that should remain private in that group and shouldn't be accessible by anybody else. And that also gives you easier administration if you plan for separate permissions as well, because you can organize the site structure to reflect the requirements for access. And so that enables you to do things like collect all content that has unique access restrictions and put them in a single site, and then assign the unique permissions to that site. Yes, I see we have a question over here.
Are you saying that these guidelines to inherit permissions and not to break them?
So initially, the preference would be to not break inheritance, but the recognition is there will be cases in where you have to. So really the best practice is to not just stick with the default, which is to inherit permissions. Understand those times where you will need to break inheritance and have a separate set of permissions.
Okay, so there's no limitations on breaking them?
No, there's no limitations on breaking them. Correct, exactly. So, as an example, creating a special sub-site for documents that contain sensitive data or that have sensitive lists and so forth. Ideally, you're going to group the people who have similar access requirements. That would be the best practice. And we do have the three default groups for you to do that. The visitors, who get the read-only experience, the members, who get the full edit experience, and then the owners, who not only control the content, but the site itself as well. Now, you do also want to follow the principle of least privilege. I mean, that should be something that should also be kind of 101 here. But we do see scenarios where customers have tried to share documents through SharePoint. They haven't done it exactly right because the person they're sharing with gets the you don't have access to this content message. And then to fix the problem, they just open it up and in some cases actually make that person an owner, even though they really should be a member or a visitor. So you're going to want to look for ways where you can control that. And again, one way to do that is simply to give people access using the built-in groups that we have. Most members are going to be, or most folks are going to be members of the members or visitors group. Very few people should be part of the owners group. Ideally, you're going to have at least 2 folks in the owners group. So if one owner's out, another owner can take over, or if one owner, something happens to them, somebody else has rights to do stuff. And ideally, don't give permissions to the individual user accounts. It's kind of like managing AD permissions, where you really want to permission a group and then just add users to or remove them from that group. All right. So bulk assigning permission for a security group is also a best practice. This can be something that can be a little challenging to do, but I've broken it down into 3 easy steps for you. You'll create a security group in Office 365. That's a single line in PowerShell. You'll bulk add users to that security group. That's 3 more lines in PowerShell. And then you'll add the security group to the SharePoint group that you want. That's 2 more lines of PowerShell. All of it, again, this is one of those slides where when you get them, you look in the notes, you'll find the exact script on how to do that you can actually just copy and paste. But as a best practice, bulk permission management is what you should be looking at, not the one-offs or one at a time. All right, let's talk about site management best practices. How many of you have a governance model for your data in your organization? How many of you know what a governance model is? Let's start with that. All right. Okay, so a governance model, if you don't know, it's really just the set of policies and roles and responsibilities and the processes that you'll establish to determine how people in your organization use information. Or to put in the context of a product, for example, how to determine people use SharePoint in your organization. So a governance model really makes it easier to let site users know when they should create a subsite or continue using a primary site, as opposed to creating a list or some other site content. So the team site owner really is responsible for creating that governance model. And that model, as I said, will largely address everything around the data that will be hosted and accessed by that site. But it will also be the site owner that may work with sub-site owners to also determine the governance model and the practices for information access and information permissions to SharePoint as well. And so governance also typically hinges right on information architecture as well. And that means that you want to enforce or you want to turn on certain features. So one might be to require a checkout of documents. You know, if you don't want that co-collaboration experience, then you want to require checkout so that you can ensure that only one person can edit and make changes to the document and you don't run into version or tracking issues. You do also want to track versions. That's one of the best features in SharePoint is having the ability to go back to previous versions, maybe compare versions and so forth. You might want to require document approval so that you can control what documents are available for consumption on the site. The documents still get uploaded, but they end up in a pending state until they're approved. And you want to leverage the built-in RSS technology that is permeated through SharePoint so that you can keep tabs on changes that are happening to sites, to libraries, and so forth. A couple other things you want to do is create workflows. Create those business processes in code and automate them as much as you can. That will save a lot of time, and it will increase productivity dramatically. And there's actually a couple case studies that we have on that out on the Microsoft.com website. You also can do things like define particular content types, which you should if you're doing anything other than Office documents or Office file formats. And you also want to definitely enable auditing and use those audit reports to track access, file changes, copies, deletions, sharing, unsharing, and so forth. All right, let's talk a little bit about Exchange Online and Exchange Online protection. How many of you are running Exchange Online today? All right, a bunch of you, great. All right, well, let's talk about a couple issues. One is shared mailboxes. How many of you are using shared mailboxes? All right, yeah, typically a lot of folks are. Well, once you combine shared mailboxes with DirSync, you run into a little issue. And that is when DirSync is enabled, we don't have a way for you to create a shared mailbox in the cloud or take a cloud mailbox that you've already created and convert it to a shared mailbox. So what that means is you'll actually have to create that mailbox on premises and then migrate it to the cloud to get it there. That was really the only way to use a shared mailbox in the cloud when you're leveraging DirSync. Transport. Transport can be a big issue for customers in the cloud, even though largely a lot of the control of transport is on Microsoft and out of the customer's hands. But there are a lot of issues that can cause problems for on-premises to cloud Mailflow or vice versa, or hybrid Mailflow, or really just sending and receiving messages across the internet if things aren't configured properly. So as an example, some of the common misconfigurations we have are folks having a smart host connector that points to a third-party gateway or system. Or, once again, invalid or expired certificates that break transport. You may want to consider having some sort of certificate management process so that, say, for instance, a month before a certificate is to expire, you have a process in place that kicks off a renewal. Third-party gateways. Third-party gateways between Office 365 and on-premises Exchange servers do not support secure mail flow. Okay, keep that in mind. And the security configurations created by the hybrid configuration wizard, they do allow for secure transport and non-anonymous transport. Okay, but the fact that you don't get to use a third-party gateway in there may be a burden to some of you. With certificates, again, it's not just about that they're valid, but they also have to be assigned for transport operations as well. And if the certificate does expire, mail's not going to NDR right away. It's going to start queuing up in the cloud, and that'll largely be because you can't use TLS in the environment anymore, but it's going to start queuing up, and eventually after 2 days, it's going to get returned as non-deliverable. And again, certificates near the expiry need to be replaced before things expire. You also want to understand how routing and mail flow is going to affect things. So for instance, if you use centralized routing, that's going to affect all of your inbound and outbound mail flow, and it's going to have it all go through Office 365. For example, if you point your MX record to Office 365, mail is going to be routed to on-premises first, and then back to Office 365 for delivery. Custom connectors, they're only honored when using transport rules and criteria-based routing, and this can often also lead to potential mail flow issues because the service will accept the creation of the connectors, but ultimately it will actually ignore them in the mail flow decision. So that can be very confusing for some customers to keep track of. And then throttling policies. Every tenant has a default throttling policy applied to them, and that's intentional. That's part of the tenant isolation features that we have in Office 365 and Azure AD. So this could, for example, prevent certain bulk operations from taking place. Now, support does have the ability to raise the throttling policy, but it's largely going to be based on the size of your organization. But even in cases where they do increase throttling policies for moves or any other throttling that's in play, there will always still be an upper limit that you will reach. And you'll want to be aware of what that upper limit is before you start doing a lot of bulk operations. So as an example, each tenant has a default Exchange Web Services throttling policy. And it's largely tuned for EWS client operations. But there are several third-party migration products that use EWS to perform migrations from various mail systems. And you'll want to work with the migration vendor to figure out what, if any, EWS throttling is going to come into play with their tool, and what, if any, exceptions can be applied to allow you to have a smooth migration. And really, if you are using one of those tools, you're going to have a discussion with your vendor as to how to optimize that for usage. And then for Exchange Online, everybody using Exchange Online is automatically using Exchange Online protection. There are some best practices, therefore, things like making sure that your default domain is updated to be one of your own domains. Seems like a no-brainer, but there's a lot of customers that forget to do that. Always do the dir sync with Office 365 before moving your MX record. Obviously, if you move it first, you'll break everything. Block executable attachments. That is a best practice, but I understand that some organizations will choose to allow them based on certain requirements that they have. But ideally, as a best practice, you would want to do that. And you'll also want to enable that bulk email setting in the content filter as well. And then that will cause any mail that is marked as bulk mail, and this is marked as a result of being on an internal bulk mail list that Microsoft maintains. So any bulk mail sender that's on that list will cause that mail to get marked as bulk mail. And those could be like advertisements, marketing materials, and so forth. That will cause them to be marked as spam and allow you to deal with them as spam. So it could mean that the sender, their IP address is known to be one where bulk mail originates. There could be also the bulk complaint level message header gets inserted, and that'll get evaluated by both Microsoft's internal bulk list and some third-party bulk lists that we use. And then we'll also look at the sender's email as well to figure out if we have any reputation metrics on them to determine if they're sending bulk mail as well. Yes, Paul?
You say to block executable attachments. Are executables not blocked by default?
They are, and we want you to keep it that way. Yes. All right, let's talk about Exchange Hybrid. Now, we have a lot of content to tell you about Exchange on-premises, to tell you about Exchange Hybrid, but we have almost no content to tell you how to get from hybrid to cloud only. So we didn't really finish the story for you. Well, that's what we're doing today. So getting there can actually be easy. Or getting from on-premises to hybrid can be easy, rather, but getting from hybrid to cloud only can be somewhat tricky. We do have one article that just came out on how and when to decommission your hybrid servers. And it really depends on what scenario that you're in and what you're doing with your intentions for identity management in DirSync. So let's talk about the scenarios. So hybrid configurations can vary in a bunch of different ways. But regardless of what your configuration is, there's really just these three primary scenarios that we cover going from hybrid to cloud only. So, and I've color-coded them so you can see where, yes, green, you can do it. Red, you shouldn't do it. And yellow is, look into it. It may or may not be possible. So you're in a hybrid organization. All your mailboxes have been moved to Exchange Online. And more importantly, you also no longer need to manage users from on-premises or use directory synchronization. And when we say you don't need to manage users, we mean not only are you not managing their identities, but you're also not managing any Exchange attributes at all. You're doing that all in the cloud now. In that particular scenario, you can then safely decommission your hybrid servers and remove Exchange completely from your on-premises environment. The only time you might ever want to keep it is if you, just for whatever reason, want to preserve the ability to go back. So scenario 2, you're in a hybrid config. You still have moved all your mailboxes to Exchange Online, but you need to keep ADFS around for authenticating your mailbox users. So in this case, because you're keeping DirSync, you can't remove your Exchange servers from your on-premises environment. You can decommission most of them, but you're going to need to leave a couple behind for user management. And typically, the remaining ones that you do leave behind, a lot of customers just turn them into virtual servers and let them run as a minimum workload. And then if you're using Exchange on-premises for other things, SMTP relay, public folders, third-party tools, line of business apps, then we would recommend keeping your hybrid servers around and not going to a cloud-only configuration. All right. And just to be clear, even though I use ADFS in the example for number 2, scenario 2 really does apply to any customer that's using any form of DirSync. All right, Skype for Business. Let's talk about that. So there's really just a couple things to say about that in terms of best practices. Skype for Business itself doesn't have general best practices. They do have some of the network tuning best practices that we talked about early on in the session. But really the couple things that you're going to be aware of is that we have now consolidated all of the content, whether it's TechNet, blogs, whether it's IT Pro, developers, information workers. It's now in our new Skype for Business Resources Center, which you can get to going to that short URL. And this will be the place where everything will be consolidated into one place for you with respect to Skype. And it's, I think the only thing that's not published in that is Link Online or Skype for Business Online dedicated. That is the only documentation that won't be there. Otherwise, everything else will be in that space. And the reason we don't have the dedicated stuff there is because we've got the direct engineering support and other resources for those customers. All right, OneDrive for Business. OneDrive for Business, again, itself doesn't really have direct best practices. So what we've done here is we've looked at high volume generators and turned them into best practices. Look out for these things. So one of the biggest call generators we've had for OneDrive. In fact, you could say almost the only call driver we've had is synchronization issues. If anybody here has been running OneDrive for Business for any amount of time, you know that synchronization issues happen, and they can happen at any time for a variety of reasons. But there are some things that you as the customer can do to at least make sure that you are covering all the common things that can cause problems. So obviously, use our OneDrive for Business sync guide for your initial setup. OneDrive for Business does seem just as easy as the consumer version, but there's a few other things that you'll want to be aware of, and those are covered in that guide. You also want to make sure that the sync app is always kept up to date, because the failure to do that is actually a very large call generator. They're using an out-of-date version, doesn't support a couple of the sync verbs, and next thing you know, things have been broken. And you also want to use valid file names. You want to use valid and limited file sizes, item count, and path length limits, because there are limitations on all of these things for Skype for Business. So that's how you avoid the issues. If you can't avoid the issues, here's some ways that you can resolve them. One way is to try the repair. Okay, my personal experience with the repair option is it'll work about 50% of the time for you, depending, of course, on what the synchronization problem is. But in my experience, out of the dozen or so times I've had to do that, it's about 50-50 as to whether or not it'll work. Sometimes stopping resyncing and restarting resyncing works. Okay, that's about another 33% of the time that'll work. And then if that doesn't work, we actually have a OneDrive for Business troubleshooter that you can walk through that will look at other configuration things and other problems that we know that can cause it as well. All right. Office Pro Plus. It's another one where activation issues here are the large generator of calls. And they've actually been fairly high and steady over the past few months. I went back 6 months on this one just to see what the trend would look like. And from about, I'd say, late November till even as recent as last week, we were getting a lot of calls on these things. So again, how do you avoid the activation issues? Well, one way is to, if the users are behind a proxy server, make sure that the settings for Windows HTTP proxy are correct. If they're behind a firewall, make sure that the Office 365 URLs and IP addresses are accessible, because if they're not, you won't be able to activate. The other thing that you're going to want to do, especially if you run into these issues to resolve them, is verify that the license is good. A lot of customers, unfortunately, forget to assign the license. You know, they set everything up, and then they forget to provision the actual thing that enables access to the services. If this was a previously licensed installation that was working, you may consider doing things like removing the product key and then re-entering it and starting over. And if that fails, believe it or not, the guidance that you would get if you called support for this issue is to uninstall and reinstall Office. Okay, so you've just installed it, it won't activate it. Unfortunately, we say try again. There are a couple troubleshooters. There's 2 different ones that you can look at as well that may be able to help you avoid an uninstall and a reinstall. But overwhelmingly, looking at the calls that we've had, that is the guidance that we would give you if you called us with one of these support issues. All right, let's talk about tools, because there's a lot of different tools, a lot you're going to hear of today. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that within the portal itself, we actually have this tool center. So if you go to Office 365 Admin Center and you click on Tools, or just go to portal.office.com/tools, sign in using your Office 365 admin credentials, and here's where you'll find things like our Office 365 readiness checks, the Office 365 Best Practices Analyzer, which is designed to make sure that your on-premises Exchange org is ready to go, and the Connectivity Analyzer, which will check network connectivity, or the Client Performance Analyzer, which will also check client performance activity over the network as well. But what's also cool is if you click on More Tools, then you'll get a couple lists, or there's actually 2 things. One is the More Tools. Oh, it didn't build right. Okay. Well, there's 2 links you can see. The More Tools, which is the diagnostic link up the top, and then the do-it-yourself troubleshooters, which is the second link there. Those will actually take you to our support website, and they'll ask you questions and guide you through troubleshooting, just like some of the other guided walkthroughs that we have for resolving issues. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the do-it-yourself troubleshooter. This is what it would look like. You would choose your service. We've got them for many Office 365 products, not just the big workloads, but also for things like Yammer and Delve, CRM Online, and even things like user and domain management as well. So if you're having identity issues, service issues, workload issues, Office client subscription issues, and so forth, there's a troubleshooter for all of that, and you simply select something from the drop-down that you see here, and it will walk you through troubleshooting the process. All right, so one of the best tools for you to use is the Office 365 readiness checks. It's part of an automated tool. It's going to gather the configuration requirements for the services that you tell it you want to set up, and then it's going to perform the readiness checks against your environment to make sure that your environment is ready for this. And then if there are any issues that it comes up with, it's going to let you know with warnings or errors as to which one may be blockers for deployment. Running the tool, you're going to run this on several occasions. Obviously, before you deploy Office 365, especially if you're in a federated or hybrid deployment. But also, if you add new features or add complexity, you're also going to want to rerun the tool and make sure everything's ready. Or if you're doing a phased deployment where you're only deploying groups of users at a certain time, before you do the next phase of your deployment, again, run the tool. The readiness checks are going to actually look at your environment based on the computer that you're currently connected to and the credentials that you're using to run the tool. So that's what it's going to use for your configuration. So ideally, we recommend, obviously, running this while logged in as an administrator. And they don't expect all the workstations. So if your users have different configurations on their workstations, go to each of the different workstations and run the tool as the administrator from each of those, so you can collect all of the different configurations that you have and see if any of them have any problems or will cause problems when you're moving to Office 365. There's two types of checks that the tool will give you. There's a quick check, which is a very basic check. It'll just complete in a couple minutes. But there's also a detailed or advanced check. Those are the ones that if you're in a more advanced scenario like DirSync, you would want to run the advanced one. That will take much longer. Could be an hour, could be 2 hours or so. And then the results will get sent to Microsoft, and they will also include basic information that will be tied to your tenant as well. So if you do need to call support and drill a little deeper and talk about some of the issues the tool might find, we'll have a lot of that basic information. The tests that were run, the failures that were incurred, the domain name that was involved, the OS and browser version, and even your IP hash as well. All right, so this is what the tool looks like if you haven't seen it. So it's showing, you can see everything is green except for users and groups. So it did found a critical issue to be fixed. Of course, the critical issue in this case was the fact that I ran it on a workstation that was not a member of a domain and did not have any DirSync going on. So of course, couldn't find any users or groups. So I would expect an error there. But everything else checked out okay. The network was fine. SharePoint and everything was all good. When the tool gives you information, this is what the results look like. And you can see we group it into two columns. One is just look at all the results. And then the other, you can click on issues to see if there's any issues. And you can see we check quite a bit of stuff here. And you can drill into the results and see. There's a couple places where we'll say things like, you're good to go because you passed the test. And again, you're going to be running this not just before you deploy, but as you make major changes and do other things as well. All right, so here's what one of the issues looks like. In my environment, this was the only issue it found. And again, that's the fact that I'm not running DirSync everywhere, and it caught on to that. So it says, please try running it from a server that has DirSync installed. So if you are in one of those more advanced environments, the workstation that you'll use would be your DirSync server in that case. Some other helpful tools, some of the bandwidth calculators that we've got one for the Exchange client, We've got one for Lync 2010 and 2013, obviously now for Skype for Business. And then there's also a OneDrive for Business sync calculator as well. Now, of course, the calculations are not going to be 100% accurate. They're going to rely on you gathering some of this data from your environment and plugging it into the calculators. And even then, some are somewhat estimates because, again, network activity can vary, user activity can vary, and so forth. But this is the best place to start when you want to figure out what your bandwidth needs are to support the workload that you're moving to the cloud. Always and only use the latest versions of these calculators because we are constantly making changes and adjustments and fixing bugs and maybe sometimes finding, a few months later that we had one of the formulas was incorrect and we had to fix that. And so always use the latest version, which all do come with change logs as well. All right, auditing and reporting. So the best practice there is literally enable auditing everywhere. Okay? For example, turn on the auditing that we have in Exchange Online, the administrator audit logging and the mailbox audit logging. So anything that the Exchange administrator does from the shell, and even though we say from the shell, that also includes the Exchange Admin Center because that's just built on top of the shell. So really any task that the administrator does is going to be logged in this audit log. And then any mailbox that's accessed by someone other than the person who owns the mailbox, that's when that would go in the mailbox audit log. Okay? Auditing is very important, not just for those of you who are required for compliance reasons, but it's also very important that all enterprises have it enabled so that you can see exactly what's going on in your environment. And for those of you who may have been at RSA conference or have heard about some of the announcements, one of the things that we announced there was this new activity feed API, or what we're calling security and compliance signals. And this is an API that you can plug into, and it gives you a near real-time feed of all the security auditing in your organization. So again, anything an admin does, anything an end user does can be part of this feed and can be collected by your organization. With respect to Exchange Online, when we talk about administrator audit logging, that would refer to anything that either the tenant admin did or even some of the Microsoft support folks, if they were doing things in a mailbox, for example. All of their actions would also be recorded in that audit log, and any delegated administrators too. So mailbox audit logging is helpful because it's going to show you who accessed a mailbox and what they did, so you definitely want to turn that on. But you also want to be aware of the limits and requirements around auditing. So there are some things that an admin can do, such as view objects. So anything that they're doing with a commandlet that starts with get, or a commandlet that starts with test, or a commandlet that starts with search, those activities are not audited. So if you're looking, if you run a command that happens to be one of those, and you're wondering why it's not audited, it's because we don't trap those. Audit log entries are kept for a default of 90 days. You can increase that value, but the default's 90 days. After 90 days, those records are deleted. And if you are configuring auditing or enabling it or disabling it, when those changes take place, they're not going to show up right away. It could take as long as 15 minutes to appear in the audit log. So if you enabled auditing for something, and then you go and you perform that action, and then you search the audit log and you wonder why that action isn't in there, it could take 15 minutes for it to appear in there. So you may just need to refresh and run that search again, and then anything that you've designated that should be audited will be in that log then after that. With mailbox audit logging, unlike administrator audit logging, that's not turned on by default, and it's not something that you turn on globally. This is something that you turn on a mailbox by mailbox basis. But here again, you're going to want to script that in PowerShell and do all of your mailboxes in bulk, hopefully. And then the mailbox audit logs, they're going to go into each individual mailbox, but it's not an area where the end user has access to. It's going to be in the audit subfolder of the recoverable items area. So we'll capture that all in there, but the end user won't have access to it. That's for administrators only. I did mention you could change the default from 90 days. The maximum that you can set it to would be roughly 68 years. Or what the UI would take is 24,850.031407 days. How's that for an oddly specific maximum value for a parameter? That works out to about 68 years. So try not to go over that number, okay? Yeah. One thing you want to watch out for, though, is because the audit logs are stored in the recoverable items folder, that does actually, well, it initially had a default of 30 gigs. We've since now rolled out worldwide 100 gigs, but you may end up getting space constrained depending on your auditing and activity. So it's possible that you could run into some issues there. But if the users that you are auditing, if they are on in-place hold or even the legacy litigation hold, then their recoverable items folder quota will default to 100 gigs instead of 30 gigs. In terms of the kinds of things that get audited, this is just a quick chart showing you the actions that could be taken and by an administrator or end user and whether or not they would appear in the audit log. All right. Partners. How many of you in the room are Office 365 or Microsoft partners? All right, a few of you. So these are really largely for you guys, although anybody who's interested in joining the Microsoft Partner Network can do so and should do so. If you are a member of the Microsoft Partner Network, then every single week we have these conference calls that all partners are invited to participate in. We talk about sales issues, compete issues, design issues, deployment, and best practices with internal Office 365 experts at Microsoft. It's generally designed for the IT managers and the technical specialists. Those are two of the roles that we've defined in the partner network. And you can go right to this URL and sign up for it. But again, keep in mind you do need to be a member of the partner network to do that. There is also one other thing for partners. There's a practice accelerator for small and medium businesses that will guide them through the fundamentals of deployment principles and the processes that lead to not just repeatable deployments, but repeatable, successful deployments for small and medium customers. And it does directly provide you with Microsoft Service best practices and resources as well, some of which, again, have made their way into this deck. This is targeted at a few other folks in the partner space, so the pre-sales technical specialists and the technical specialists, consultants, practice managers, and so forth. But again, you do need to be a member of the Microsoft Partner Network to register. All right, with that, that's all I have. I've got a few minutes to take questions. If you do have a question, please come up to one of the microphones that you see around the room. And if you don't have any questions, thank you very much for coming and hope you enjoy the rest of Ignite.
So quick question around the enable the bulk email option. I think you were saying, just a confirmation, that once you have that enabled, any email that's flagged or triggered will go to the spam quarantine. So if I enable the user notification of spam quarantine, will the users be able to see that and release? Yes, and it's not any mail coming through. It has to be identified as bulk mail, so it's got to be a sender or an IP address that's on either the list of bulk mail senders that Microsoft maintains or that a couple third-party providers maintain. If they're on that list, or if some path along the way has inserted a bulk confidence level and stamped a number on it that says we're pretty sure this is bulk, or based on sender reputation, if the sender is known to be a bulk mail sender, those things or any combination thereof would cause the mail to get marked as spam. And then anything that you're doing now to deal with spam, whether it's the user notification of the quarantine or rejecting it or however you've configured it, it would behave the same way for those messages.
Okay, great. Because I was using a third-party appliance before, and they do have the commercial bulk option. However, then the users don't have a visibility to it.
Right.
Right.
Does the vendor you're using, do they support the BCL number? So were they inserting it into the header?
I'm not sure if they do, but we eliminated it already since I have a hybrid mode turned on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you could check on that, because if they're doing that, you could still continue to use that. They could add the BCL header to it, and then when it comes into EOP, then it can be tracked as a bulk message and treated as spam.
Okay, great. And just a side question. You know, there is an SPF option that you can turn on, but that is definitely not catching the heart.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So is there any other recommendations?
Yeah,
around
there's a few things. What I would do is if you go to Jennifer Gagnon and Scott Landry's session, the notes from the field on EOP, they're covering a lot of that stuff. I actually wanted to cover more EOP best practices in this deck, but they're
Right.
doing a whole session on them. So
Is it? Okay, I can look it up.
yeah, I
maybe
don't
tomorrow.
remember exactly when it is. I'm pretty sure it hasn't happened yet, but even if it has, every session's going to be on Channel 9 within 48 hours of the
Okay.
session, so you should be able to see it either way.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's go over here next. We'll go back and forth.
I just wanted to see where I could get a copy of your notes.
The slide deck will be on the Channel 9 website with the recording within 48 hours from now.
My experience with shared mailboxes is different than what you said, so I want to make sure I understood what you said or see if I'm doing something wrong. We have a hybrid environment where we are taking termed users and converting we use DirSync, and we're converting the termed users' mailboxes into shared mailboxes so that we can remove the license, but the mailbox can still be accessed by users, and that's working. But I think you said that...
Where's your mailbox located? Locally?
No, in the cloud.
So you really, once DirSync is enabled, we don't give you the UI to do that anymore. So how exactly
I'm
are you
using
doing that?
PowerShell, and
No, I
it's-
mean PowerShell's a UI. We don't give you
Okay.
the commandlet to do that. So how exactly are you doing that?
with PowerShell.
No, what specific commandlet and parameters?
Y-
I think it's something like this, but
Yeah. Set mailbox type or something.
conversion or something like that.
Okay.
Okay. Let's,
Yeah, so it is working.
let me
so-
look into that. Let's take that offline.
Okay.
I'll
maybe
see if I
it's
can
a-
figure out an answer for you.
We remove the license. Yeah.
Before you convert it?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if it's before or after, to be honest.
So in that case, it's not. Yeah, I believe in that case we'll let you do it.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll still look into that too. If you want to connect with me offline, this should be your incentive to do that. I should have handed these out. So those of you who are staying late, yeah, ask a question, get a shirt. I don't want to throw it at you because I don't want to hit this gentleman in the face, unless you'd like me to. Yeah,
It takes all kinds.
I know.
You got an XL?
I think part of it, like you said, if you enable audit logging on mailbox, where is that audit information stored exactly?
Inside each user's mailbox, in the audits folder within. Yes, yes,
So if we have like
In the recoverable items folder.
yes. That's T-shirt worthy. Good catch. Sorry, that was a little high.
You got an
yes.
XL?
No.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry. Only
Okay.
large.
Uh,
You're welcome to it.
eh.
Okay.
So
last
we're-
question, and because I'm a minute over.
We're going to Office 365. We're setting up a proof of concept to do with a metaverse with 3 separate forests. The contractor with whom we're doing the work has gotten it to work in a lab with DirSync, with multiple Exchange organizations. Your slides were showing that is that not supported, or is it? No. I mean, the thing here is that we're still 2010.
Right.
And one of the organizations is 2013. My understanding is that in order to do a proper hybrid environment with a single tenant, that you have to be 2013 across.
You have to do 2013 SP1, actually.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But he was. Your notes were saying that DirSync doesn't work in that manner. They somehow got it to work. Is that it's just not supported, or?
I don't think you saw it in this deck. I don't think I had a slide on that.
Yeah,
in
you
this
said
one. In a previous deck we did.
DirSync couldn't be used with multi-forest.
Right, yeah.
But
That
AD
right.
sync
So DirSync is
could.
for the single forest, so you'd use Azure AD Sync for a multi-forest environment.
But if I want to do that, I have to be 2013 SP1.
No, it's
No?
just the directory tool itself, the DirSync tool itself.
Okay.
I mean, the SP1 requirements are
Okay.
the
Separate
one-to-many.
from the hybrid.
Yeah, that's the one-to-many
Understood.
thing. But in
Okay.
terms of the DirSync tool, we make it even more complicated because we use the term DirSync generically, but we
Right.
also use it for the original tool. So
Okay.
the DirSync tool, the one that's actually called DirSync, cannot be used in multi-forest environments. It's single forest only.
Okay.
If you're in a multi-forest environment, you have to use Azure AD Sync,
Gotcha.
which includes all the functionality of DirSync
Right.
plus the extra things.
ability
and then
to do-
Azure AD
sure.
Connect will include everything. Yeah.
Okay. And then with Outlook clients, I had read that it's only mainstream supported clients for Outlook connections.
Yes.
What about, so 2007 is unsupported now at this point?
It will be when 2016 is released.
So matter of months at this point.
So yeah, well, keep in mind 2007 is out of mainstream support
Right.
anyway. So
Right.
really, there is a minimum requirement of only using mainstream support
Right.
browsers and operating systems and Outlook clients. So ideally, you would want 2010 or later.
Greater, sure.
We actually have those documented. There's a page that talks about minimum requirements.
I do remember reading that, but the partner.
We update every so often and add additional patches.
As a matter of fact, I have seen one that says.
Do you want a SharePoint shirt? That's okay. You're just here for the shirts. I get it. All right, Paul, it's large, but you're welcome to it.
Sure. Thank you, sir.
Well, I didn't have an extra large, so. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, or the four of you.